that moves. eNCA.com.
Well, the US spy saga rages on. A new report reveals that the National Security Agency monitored the calls of 35 world leaders. But how do spies actually hack into phones? Well, let's get some answers from tech analyst Craig Wilson. Craig, afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you know how this works?
Only a pleasure. Well, in a lot of instances, it's really as simple as governments demanding of cell phone operators and other telecommunications providers that they provide them access through what they call a back door. And literally, they get access to the phone records. In some instances, though, it's not access to the calls themselves, but rather access to lists of the numbers dialed. But of course, this can be very revealing too. If you can tell who is calling who and for how long, you can extrapolate quite a lot of data out of that too.
How legal is all of this?
Well, this is one of the big issues, of course, that the US is facing, is at least at home, the US can get away with all sorts of things that are covered by its own legislation. But in terms of international breaches like we've seen this week, we're going to have to see how the law plays out on this, because frankly, we don't really have guidelines in place to deal with these sorts of breaches.
But why are people surprised? I mean, one would imagine that that kind of espionage at that level would be taking place, and a cell phone is the easiest tool in which to do it.
Absolutely. I guess the shock is that generally there's sort of unspoken rules about this, particularly when it comes to allies. It's not like the US and Germany are at loggerheads, and to hear that the Chancellor's phone is bugged, I think is particularly alarming if you think that it's your friends doing the listening.
Yes, yes. And you said they can get a lot of data even just by getting the number of calls that you made or the people that you called. What kind of data could they extrapolate from that?
Well, I mean, imagine, if they can link a lot of those numbers together and see who is calling whom, there might be some surprises there. Perhaps calls to other world leaders that weren't expected, calls between leaders who aren't necessarily thought to be on speaking terms. Really, the options are alarming. Of course, you also run the risk of false positives, of people calling or being labeled as having had contact with people that perhaps they shouldn't have. And of course, these may be erroneous.
And here domestically, I mean, how much of this do we know to be happening?
Well, we have to wonder. I mean, there's certainly been suspicion in the papers in recent weeks about this. And I think there's no doubt there is monitoring going on. The question is to what extent, and whether, of course, we'll have revelations of the Snowden sort or scale in years to come in South Africa.
There was a lot of concern when the RICA legislation was brought in that, I mean, who would have our details? Absolutely. Would people be using that to actually, but has that made it easier, do you think, or does that legislation protect us?
I think it makes it easier, if anything.
Yeah.
Simply because by the same token, as we've seen in the US, here we've got a position now where government can put out warrants to the cell phone operators and force them to comply and hand over personal information, where previously when phones were unregistered, this would be a lot more difficult for governments to do.
Now, Craig, I'm curious about this. What I've heard is that, for example, if you walk into a meeting you're meeting a source, for example,
Sure.
that they won't accept the fact that you just switch off your phone and say, no, my cell phone is off. They want you to actually take off the back, yank out the cell phone and the battery, because apparently whoever is scanning it is able to do it even then. Is that the case?
I think this is perhaps excessively careful. I think really the removing the battery is to make sure that the phone really is off and that you haven't simply been misleading them. Also, of course, impossible now that more and more phones have the batteries built in. But we've certainly seen this sort of paranoia. But what these sorts of reports suggest is that perhaps maybe it's less paranoia and more good common sense, actually. If you're having a sensitive conversation, try and have it in person.
News that moves. eNCA.com.